You're listening to The Pivot, brought to you by Globally News, where we discuss the leaders, states, networks, ideologies and technologies that are reshaping the world order. Visit our website at globally.news. That's globe.ly.news.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Pivot. My name is Arif Rafiq, and I'm your host. We've got a very important episode today. It's on the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. We'll be discussing where the conflict is headed, Hamas's motivations, the role of regional powers, as well as the United States, and how intra-Palestinian politics might play out. So to help us answer these questions, we're joined by Khaled Elgindy. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, Khaled was a fellow at the Brookings Institute, which published his book in 2019, The Blind Spot, which looks at the history of relations between the United States and the Palestinians and the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. This is a really informative study, and I highly recommend that you all read it. We have a link to it in the show notes. And the book builds off of Khaled's experience as an advisor to the Palestinian negotiation team in Ramallah on those final status talks with the Israelis in the mid-2000s. So Khaled will be an important resource in terms of helping us understand this crisis as it develops in the coming days and weeks. Khaled, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, we're recording right now on Wednesday here on the East Coast in the U.S. It's late in the evening in Jerusalem. And just to summarize where things stand, we've got a very dynamic situation on the ground, especially in the wake of yesterday's attacks on the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza. Now, there aren't definitive indications of who was responsible, but the blast does reflect the brutal toll that the conflict is having on civilians of both sides. After the Hamas massacre of over 1,000 civilians on October 7th, roughly 3,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israel. And there's a particularly grave humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza, with around 1 million people displaced and they're running out of food and water. So the situation there is quite existential in nature. Now, President Biden's met with Prime Minister Netanyahu today ahead of a potential Israeli ground offensive. He's announced a quote-unquote unprecedented support package for Israel. And the planned summit with Arab leaders in Jordan has been canceled in reaction to yesterday's hospital bombing. So, Khaled, I'd like to start by just asking you where you see things might be going in the next few days, or maybe a better way to ask this is, what should we be looking out for?
Well, I think the things that we should be looking out for are the human costs. I'm usually asked to comment on the politics and the policy part of things, but that's inseparable from the human situation on the ground. Like most people, I was horrified at the October 7th attacks by Hamas. We can talk a little bit about where that came from, but I think since then we've seen this unprecedented offensive on Gaza as a population. I think that's important for people to know, that Israel is not only targeting Hamas, it is targeting the population. And we know that because one, they've said so. They've said that they are not interested in precision, they're interested in damage, and that they don't distinguish between militants and the civilian population. I think when things go wrong, then there's a tendency to then come back and say, oh, well, that's, there was some sort of mistake or misfire or something along those lines. But the rhetoric from the Israeli leadership has been fairly clear that this is an assault on the Palestinian population. The other way we know that is because Israel has taken the extraordinary and quite dangerous step of cutting all food, fuel, medicine, electricity, water to the 2.2 million people who live in the Gaza Strip. That in of itself is a war crime, and it's quite a severe one. The idea, of course, is that you can't use starvation as a weapon. The international community has spoken out against that quite clearly when it was done by the Russians in Ukraine, and so we have an unfolding humanitarian disaster. Almost 1 million Palestinians, if you try to wrap your brain around this, there are 2.2 million people who live in Gaza. Almost half of them have been displaced internally in a very, very small space. People are running out of food and water. People are drinking seawater. People are drinking contaminated water. The international community has been very, very slow in its response, I think, out of a sense of loyalty to Israel, that not wanting to criticize them when they were still reeling from this national trauma. But the human side of that, I think, is understandable, but it's not the responsible thing to do, to simply give Israel a blank check, both in military terms and in humanitarian terms. And I think that's a real failure on the part of the United States and Western powers in particular, as champions of what we used to call the rules-based international order. So I think right now, for me, the most serious urgent need is for a ceasefire and for urgent humanitarian assistance, and simply for Israel to allow food and medicine and all of that back into Gaza.
Mm. Now, the level of brutality towards the Palestinians right now may be unprecedented in its scale, but, this is part of a reoccurring cycle where there is, let's say, a series of attacks by Hamas, and then the Israeli response is overwhelming and totally out of proportion. So, before this month, we've seen since 2008, according to the United Nations, from 2008 into September of this year, 3,800 Palestinians were killed by 3,800 Palestinian civilians were killed by Israel, and around 170 Israeli civilians were killed by groups based in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories. So that's a 20-fold difference in terms of civilian deaths. And so the nature of this conflict is very skewed in terms of the human cost. And what stands out for me is the fact that there is a very clear high level of tolerance in Washington and other Western capitals for a phenomenally high fatality rate among Palestinian civilians. Do you agree with that? And what explains that?
Sadly and tragically, I would agree with that. I think the current war has highlighted that in very dramatic form for me, because we're seeing it unfold in real time and on a massive scale. It's one thing when, we had sort of grown accustomed and in some ways also very sadly desensitized to, to 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 Palestinians killed every day for years and years and years. And then of course, that's in addition to, on a daily basis. That's what, the international community considers the calm. When things are calm, it's when Palestinians are dying in relatively small numbers. Homes are being demolished. They're losing their land. They're losing, right? And that's it in the West Bank. In Gaza, it's even worse, right? Because you have this suffocating blockade, this grinding, slow death is how I've heard it described by Palestinians in Gaza, that it's not really living. We've seen record increases in mental health issues like depression and anxiety, particularly among children who've been traumatized repeatedly after many wars, right? There's 1 million children in Gaza. Almost half the population are under the age of 18. And they've never known a day of quiet or peace or security or safety. And that has long-term consequences. But it's one thing when you kind of get desensitized that because it's a slow death. And then you look back at the numbers and you see, wow, this has not been a time of quiet at all. And then now, where you have very large numbers of Palestinians dying, injured, displaced, civilian convoys trying to flee are themselves bombed. The border, Rafah, is bombed. Civilian infrastructure is bombed. A hospital is bombed. Eventually we'll know what happened with regard to Al Ahli Hospital. We don't have all the facts now, but it's not unprecedented for Israel to bomb hospitals. We've seen this in previous wars as well. And so seeing this scale of Palestinian suffering in the midst of almost total silence from the international community has really hammered home the extent to which Palestinian lives are devalued. That's hard for me to say because it has really awful implications for me personally, for my family, for our communities as Arab Americans or as American Muslims, where it feels like we are being devalued. We're not even allowed to grieve, or express solidarity with Palestinians who are dying and being killed in huge numbers, because then we risk being accused of being pro-Hamas. The American media has fed into this very dehumanizing rhetoric that we see from elected officials, certainly from the Israeli government. And so it's very hard to not conclude, one, that Palestinian life is pretty cheap. When you see European powers defending the total cutoff of food and fuel and medicine to a besieged population, that's really scary stuff there. And I think it's been jarring for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, even when you look at the U.S. news coverage, there are some networks that are pretty bombastic in their coverage. For more centrist news channels like CNN, the framing totally eliminates the Palestinians. They're not even in the picture. So they've branded their coverage since October 7th as Israel at War. And then we see various iterations of that on other channels like War in Israel. So the Palestinians are being, in terms of severity, are being most impacted, yet they're not even in the picture. And when you see them on television, they're usually that little silent rectangle box in the corner where they show visuals of Gaza from Israel. And I think that's a powerful metaphor, because the entire crisis is being looked at from Israel, and a more balanced perspective would look at things from both sides, and multiple sides, in fact, because these are divided, polarized societies to some degree in a political sense, even though there's a great human cost there. Now, President Biden today was in Israel today, and he told the Israelis in a public address, he said, "You are not alone." And I'm wondering, you touched upon, the posture of the U.S. as well as the EU, and I'm wondering who's with the Palestinians. They're not even addressed here. And in the past, and you can comment on this, the EU seems to have played a much more balanced role, seems to have sort of helped balance the tilt of the U.S. towards Israel, and in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian question. That balance seems to no longer exist. So I'm wondering why that's the case, and then who's there in terms of the international picture for the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's been really shocking. I mean, Europe, unlike the American officials, they talk quite a lot about international humanitarian law, about a rules-based order, about human rights, these basic principles that they pride themselves on, and we see that really lacking in this context. And I don't think I think it's not only Palestinians who've noticed. I think the broader Arab world has noticed. I think the global South in general has taken note, particularly when you look at the similar kinds of actions happening in Ukraine, and there's a total different response from the West. I think a lot of people had suspected that double standard in the past, but now I think it's been cemented. And as far as who is supporting the Palestinians, remarkably, at a grassroots level, there is still quite a lot of support for Palestinians, even in the West. We've seen in places like Germany, for example, where it's illegal, where they ban legally any pro-Palestinian or Palestinian solidarity marches. And you see people defying those bans and coming out anyway. Of course, Germany has its own history and in many ways has overcompensated for its genocidal past by restricting anything that Israelis or the Jewish community might find troubling. And you see elements of that in the West, in other Western societies, like in France, in the UK, where they're banning Palestinian flags. But at a grassroots level, there still is, I think, a lot of support for Palestinians. I think people understand the hugely asymmetrical power dynamics. I don't know of anyone who supported what Hamas did on October 7th. Yeah, so we have seen an outpouring of some sort at the grassroots level of support for Palestinians in the West, in Europe, but even here in the United States on college campuses, and if you look at public opinion trends, I think those will largely hold as far as people of color and people on the left end of the political spectrum and other constituencies that have generally become much more supportive of Palestinian rights. Where we're seeing the biggest outpouring now of support is in the Arab world. There have been quite large demonstrations, particularly following the attack on the hospital yesterday, in Jordan, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Tunisia. I've even seen pictures of demonstrators in Cairo. And so we know that the Arab world at a public opinion level still cares about the Palestinian issue and cares about Palestinian rights, even if their governments seemingly have kind of abandoned the Palestinians.
And you make a number of really interesting points. And I think that contrast between the Western approach on Ukraine versus its approach towards the Palestinian issue really highlights how on Ukraine, this is where they profess their ideals, their norms about their own societies, as well as the global system or the international system. And then with the Palestinians, with the Palestinian question, that is the great exception. There's an asterisk there. So that even pertains to protest here in Europe, civil disobedience or nonviolent opposition to Israeli policy towards the Palestinians in terms of boycotts and things like that. So, we have some states that are effectively banning those kinds of campaigns. So we see, a real, I guess, you can call it hypocrisy of the West. And it used to be maybe just a segment of the United States, but this has kind of transcended certain, political constituencies in the United States, including, the South and evangelical Christians and all that. It's become a political norm in many respects. But now we have, I think, also an emerging clear divide, at least in the United States, on a generational level and along racial lines in terms of bridging this sympathy gap for the Palestinians and the Israelis. Because in the end, I think a prevalent norm among this generation or Gen Z younger folks who are able to vote is that they firmly believe in the equality of peoples. And that is being tested in terms of this ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I just want to get to, this question of next moves, because ultimately, the center of gravity is the border or the line of control between Israel and Gaza. And there's a question of whether Israel will move forward with the ground invasion. Now, I'd like you to talk about the risks associated with that, one, at a humanitarian level, and then two, at a political level, because we're seeing some really crazy ideas being proposed out there. For example, Bret Stephens of the New York Times has talked about a kind of a regime change in Gaza and replacing at least the security structure there with a kind of a Saudi-led peacekeeping force. And I've seen this idea repeated elsewhere, but not by Arabs, not by anybody locally, at least in terms of the Arab world. And there is this kind of imaginary discourse that people who are just writing op-eds just make these seemingly random ideas. There's, as we saw in Iraq, when you eliminate a kind of a power structure, something else fills the void. So right. I'd like you to talk about the risks of an impending Israeli ground invasion on a humanitarian level, and then also on a political level.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first impression, as you were just describing the question, was we really have learned nothing from the past 22 years, right? And our own experiences in this country with attempted regime change. and trying to re-engineer other people's societies. It usually does not go well. And in fact, it will almost never go well, particularly when there's very little understanding of those societies. So, but as far as the ground invasion, I think ground invasion becomes more likely every day, and we're hearing words of caution from the Biden administration about a ground invasion. But ultimately, the U.S. will support anything that Israel does militarily, even if it thinks it's a bad idea, like a ground invasion. And I think there is I wouldn't call it a consensus, but there are many voices in Washington and the analyst community who are saying that a ground invasion will be disastrous, not only for Palestinians, but also for Israelis. The danger, of course, on the Israeli side is that they will take a lot of casualties. They will have to go house to house in a guerrilla warfare type environment where they have a disadvantage with all of their intelligence and technology. And we saw how, what a failure and lapse there was in those same assets on October 7th. But it's not like being from the inside and knowing it intimately above ground and beneath the ground. So that will be difficult. It will also involve a lot of destruction. And we can assume that Israel's order for 1 million Palestinians to evacuate from the north to the south of Gaza is part of that calculation, that they're anticipating a kind of massive campaign of ground forces. They have mobilized a huge number of reservists, something like more than 300,000 reservists. So we don't know exactly how many will go in, but it will be very costly on all sides, but particularly for Palestinians. We've seen in the past Israeli ground invasions remarkably do more damage than aerial bombardment in the kind of scale of destruction that they entail. So we're going to see huge numbers of casualties on both sides, and that will increase the costs. That will increase the costs for Israelis domestically once Israeli soldiers start coming home in body bags, and of course there will also be costs in terms of Israel's image around the world as the death toll on the Palestinian side mounts. And so these are considerations. In addition to the increased risk of other actors getting involved, like Hezbollah and Iran, I think the longer ground invasions will take a long time. And the longer this conflict goes on, the more likely those outside actors are to jump into the fray and then expand this conflict. And the really scary part, as if all of that isn't, everything we've seen and are seeing now isn't scary enough. The really scary part is that nobody really has an end game. The Israelis do not have an end game. Hamas certainly did not have an end game when it carried out this attack. And the West doesn't have an end game. Israel's stated purpose is they're going to remove Hamas's governing and military capabilities. I'm not sure that that's attainable. In fact, I feel fairly confident in saying it's not attainable. You cannot erase a political movement with military action. And this is the problem, right? Is Israel has traditionally tried to solve what are essentially political issues through military means almost exclusively. So that will not be achievable. But we know at a minimum, Hamas will not be the governing force in Gaza after whenever this is finished. But nobody can say what will fill the void. And as you said, there are these kind of fantastical ideas being thrown around that are largely disconnected from reality, that are not based, they're not coming from people with an intimate knowledge of the region and its politics and society. It's really coming from the outside. And we saw what happens when people who don't know the realities on the ground try to play with the lives of millions of human beings as though they were pieces on a game board or a video game. And it's really frightening stuff, because this is the sort of thing that these are the sorts of ideas that are likely to gain traction inside the administration, because if only because they haven't thought about anything else. They haven't really given much thought to this issue in the 3 years that they've been in office already.
And I want to pick up on that point, and you'd made another point earlier about how U.S. policy. You'd basically said that U.S. policy toward the region or towards this crisis is effectively being, determined by the leadership in Israel. And so, in many ways, the U.S. is following Israel's lead on its policy towards the Middle East. And I'm wondering, when we look at the Biden administration's general policy towards the region, it seems to have essentially inherited and embraced the Trumpian strategy, which was made by Likud and aligned people in that administration about marginalizing the Palestinians, pushing forward normalization with Gulf Arab states and maybe other Muslim majority states as a way to sideline the Palestinian issue. And for many states in the region, for the elites, it served their interest because that provided a kind of a buffer against certain tensions with the United States in terms of their own domestic records and other regional wars and things like that. So I'm wondering, when we look at this kind of big picture, the world's most powerful country, the United States, is kind of ambling into what could be a broader regional war, but at the very least, it will have disastrous effects in Gaza and much of perhaps even the West Bank. And so I'm wondering, and you can talk here also about Hamas's motivations, but it seems to me that the U.S. is in the back seat. And we have, its policy toward Israel and Palestine effectively being determined by Hamas and the Israelis, because these are the two main belligerents in this conflict in terms of networked actors. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on all this, and what would you propose as an alternative?
Yeah, so it's really hard to know what the American interest is here, at least as far as it relates to the Biden administration. I would characterize the policy up until last week as one of strategic neglect, whereby we knew that the Palestinian issue and a two-state solution were not priorities. They were very, very low down on the list of the administration's priorities. The administration was intent on doing as little as it could possibly get away with, while still being seen somehow as credible. And there was this sense, I think, that had prevailed within the administration that, as long as Israel is comfortable, as long as the costs, frankly, I've said this before, been saying it for the past 3 years, as long as the costs for the status quo were borne mainly or exclusively by Palestinians, then there was no urgent need to change that status quo. That tells us something a little bit about Hamas's motivation for launching this attack. I think they were first and foremost trying to irrevocably alter that status quo to ensure we could never go back to it. Of course, they did that in spades, but it was also intended, I think, to kind of shake the Americans and the international community out of their sense of complacency, that it won't be only Palestinians who pay a price for the status quo. I don't think that message has been received. I think that this administration, if anything, is doubling down on its approach of ignoring the Palestinian issue, again, except as minimally necessary, for example, to avoid a humanitarian disaster in this case, just to kind of keep things calm. But I doubt very much that they're thinking about, well, what happens if the West Bank explodes? What happens if Abu Mazen departs one way or another? The Palestinian leadership. What happens if the PA collapses? We have demonstrations in the West Bank calling for the overthrow of the regime, as it were, right? What does that even mean, to overthrow a non-state regime that has limited jurisdiction over a few pockets of territory in the West Bank? And none of these questions, these really, really important questions, never mind the future of a two-state solution, that for a lot of analysts and scholars, they've already said that it's over. All of these issues are still not on the agenda for the administration. I just did another panel discussion with an Israeli former diplomat who was saying that he feels confident that after the dust settles, that there will be a renewed push for some sort of diplomatic process to move toward a two-state solution and all that. I think that is highly unlikely. I think that's a lot of wishful thinking. This administration is not interested in that. If they were uninterested before, they're definitely more uninterested now. We know already the Israeli government, the most right-wing in Israel's history, the most dedicated to annexation and greater Israel, is also not interested in any of that. And in fact, is more interested in dismantling the Palestinian national project as a whole. And I think we're seeing that now. We're seeing a rise in violence by the army against Palestinians. Something like 60 Palestinians have been killed just in the last 10 days in the West Bank. Again, these are mostly unarmed protesters, while the world obviously is looking elsewhere. Settler violence is going to increase, and we're already seeing it now. We're seeing a ramping up of the pressure. So all of the negative trends that got us to this point where Palestinians felt this sense of despair are intensifying, and there is nothing to stand in the way. There is no horizon. Europe is not putting a plan forward for the day after, some kind of, something that Palestinians can look forward to. They only can look forward to more misery. And, Gaza is kind of an example of what will happen if you attempt to alter the status quo. That's how Palestinians are going to see it. And that's the part that I think is it's not most distressing, because there's obviously quite a lot that is more distressing, but it's alarming that there is no thought being given to the future and addressing all of the root causes for why we are where we are.
Yeah, and with respect to root causes, talk to us. Let's step back a bit and talk about the broader picture of how the U.S. has addressed the Palestinian question. Let's build off of your experience as an advisor to the Palestinian negotiation team in the 1990s and into the end of the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. We did see the United States try to facilitate, maybe even negotiate a final peace settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But let's go a bit deeper into that. And I think it seems to me that the fundamental questions, the political aspirations of the Palestinians have always been secondary to other issues, whether it's U.S. election cycles, volatile politics in Israel. And so I'm wondering, how do the failures of the peace process that is, sort of non-existent now inform our understanding of things today? Is there some continuity in terms of how U.S. policy elites have approached Palestinians?
Yeah, I think there is. And that's why I wrote a book called Blind Spot, because I think that blind spot has been quite persistent, not only over the last 30 years, but over the last 100 years, even before there was an Israel or PLO or anything along those lines. That blind spot was there. And that blind spot is a result of this tendency. It's more than a tendency, but of this tendency to look at the Palestinians through an Israeli or Zionist lens, through the lens of Israeli priorities, Israeli needs, Israeli interests, Israeli narratives, Israeli suffering, Israeli humanity. That filters out those same things, Palestinian interests, Palestinian needs, humanity, and so forth, from the picture. And so the United States has never been a fair broker in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians. But even so, there was an expectation that they could be an effective broker, because at the end of the day, the U.S. would realize that a two-state solution would be the way to stabilize the region, to address the root of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and therefore, bring stability to the Middle East. And that was the path to normalization. It went through the Palestinian issue. Now that formula has been reversed. People saying, well, it's just not possible to deal with the Palestinian issue. It's too hard. The parties aren't ready. The leaders aren't there. There are all kinds of pretexts that are thrown around. Let's just bypass it and move straight to the normalization part and resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict without dealing with the Palestinian issue. Again, I think that is part of the motivation, both, what has led to the sense of Palestinian despair and part of Hamas's calculation in launching this attack. And we're still seeing that now, right? It's not as though people have come to the realization that, oh, well, after this happened, maybe this might still happen in some circles, but it doesn't seem to be happening in the decision-making circles right now in Washington, in which they say, maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe we should reevaluate our approach. Maybe we should have paid more attention to the Palestinian issue. Maybe we should have done this or done that. Maybe we should have stopped those settlements or stopped those homes, those people from being evicted from their homes. Or maybe we should have not tolerated a 16-year blockade that eviscerated any semblance of normal life in Gaza for 2 million people. But that isn't happening. People aren't now having this moment of self-reflection and self-awareness and self-criticism, but instead are doubling down on the failed assumptions that brought on this crisis in the first place.
In terms of that policy over the past, couple of decades, we saw the emergence of a kind of a supposedly semi-autonomous Palestinian Authority. It was led by leaders from Fatah and the PLO, groups that had led the Palestinian movement for liberation and statehood. Now, many of those leaders are very unpopular. And we have other forces, including Hamas, but not just Hamas, also folks like Marwan Barghouti, who's currently imprisoned, who are much more popular. And I'm wondering, do you see any introspection in Washington on how their own policies toward not just the Palestinians, but the broader Arab world delegitimizes state actors that maybe at least in terms of policy circles in the United States are favored, that we'd want them to succeed. And in the end, people like Mahmoud Abbas become security contractors. They're subcontracted with ensuring the security of Israel as opposed to the national aspirations of their own people and their own desire for peace and prosperity. So is there any introspection in this in Washington, or the Palestinians and the issue of legitimacy and their own aspirations are so secondary it doesn't even rise to the surface?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, I would say there has been some introspection in certain circles, in the think tank community, in the analyst community, even in the policy community, in government, folks who've been in and out of government. There is some introspection happening, but that does not apply to the people who are currently in the administration. In this administration, I think there were elements, say, in the Obama administration, who were aware of that and had a sense of past failures and that we need to do things a little bit differently. And I think even President Obama himself had a certain level of that in his own personal approach to the issue. At the end of the day, it didn't really translate into major policy shifts. There were sort of cosmetic differences in how the administration dealt with it. But in terms of the broader environment they were working in, it was highly resistant to that, right? You had Congress that under Obama, at least, was dominated by Republicans who had bought into not just an Israeli narrative, but a far-right Israeli narrative. There was no space for considering what it might be in the interests of Palestinians. And they were even to the point of kind of abandoning the idea of a Palestinian state, right, and two-state solution. The Republican Party formally renounced the two-state solution in 2016. So while there are some pockets of change and self-reflection, for the most part, Washington as a whole has been resistant to that change because it's hard. It's hard to come to the conclusion that you've made mistakes that aren't minor, but that were major, that your underlying assumptions were faulty. Not just that you made a mistake at a tactical level, but that your entire approach has been flawed. And there's a lot more resistance to that for obvious reasons. It involves a level of humility that is very difficult for Washington. It's not part of the culture.
So, and final question, in your view, what does the future hold for the Palestinian people? And I know this is a tough question, it's very open-ended, but what do you see as the future for the Palestinian question?
Yeah, it is a very difficult question because everything looks so dark and gloomy at the moment, and it's hard to see any bright spots at all. I think once the urgency of the humanitarian situation on the ground is dealt with, and there's an end to the killing, I won't even call it fighting, but there's an end to the killing that's happening in Gaza, and people can start to pick up the pieces of their lives again, and there's some kind of reconstruction for Gaza, and people can go back to their homes, or at least try and rebuild their homes. I think the focus that Palestinians should have after that is to really look and do some introspection of their own, which I know that they're already doing in general, but history has taught us over and over again that when Palestinians don't have a credible leadership, an effective or credible leadership, that's when bad things happen to Palestinians. Not that would be enough to overcome the huge power asymmetry, but it's sort of a minimal, but it's a necessary but insufficient condition, let's say, for changing their situation. It won't be Egypt or Saudi Arabia or the Abraham Accords or the European Union or the United States that rescue Palestinians. It will have to start with Palestinians reasserting their own agency, reviving their own failed political institutions, rebuilding their national movement from the ashes of whatever may be left of Hamas and its authority in Gaza, as well as the other failed authority in the West Bank led by Mahmoud Abbas. What the future will hold is up to Palestinians. Will they, rally around some new version of a two-state solution? Will they build a new consensus toward a one-state solution in the form of an anti-apartheid struggle for equality? That's up to them. But right now, it's very hard to imagine any international actor or initiative being meaningful without, a revival of Palestinian politics and political leadership, because that is absolutely essential. It's the minimum requirement, I think, for Palestinians to go forward. And I would hope that if anything positive can come out of this nightmare, it would be a sense of urgency to rebuild the Palestinian national movement.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Khaled. The future is deeply uncertain. None of us know what will happen in the next few days, let alone the next few months or years. But you've really helped us unpack some of the uncertainty and the complexity in this intractable dispute. Thank you, Khaled.
Yeah, thanks for having me.